For 15 years, Ivana Trump was married to a man who would eventually become president of the United States, and for most of that time, the public saw the version of their marriage that got sold in magazines. The furs, the yacht, the penthouse, the perfect blonde wife standing next to the ambitious young developer. What actually happened behind that image was a lot messier, a lot more calculated, and in some parts, genuinely disturbing. There's a sworn deposition with the word rape in it. There's a decade of prenuptial agreements that kept getting rewritten as the stakes got higher. There's a confrontation on a ski slope in Aspen that ended up on the front page of every tabloid in New York. There's a headline about the affair that got so famous it's still referenced today, decades after everyone involved moved on with their lives. Before we get into all of it, if you're into stories about power, money, and what happens when a marriage becomes a business deal, hit subscribe now, because we're about to spend the next half hour going through every part of this, and there's a lot more where this came from. Everything in this video is drawn from court records, sworn testimony, interviews Ivana gave over the decades, and reporting from the people who covered this story as it happened. So let's start where it actually began, which is not in a Manhattan boardroom, but in a small industrial town in communist Czechoslovakia. Ivana Marie Zelničková was born on February 20th, 1949, in Gottwaldhof, a town in Czechoslovakia now known by its original name, Zlín. Her father, Miloš, was an engineer. Her mother, Marie, worked as a telephone operator. Ivana was a sickly infant who spent months in an incubator, which makes what came next a little ironic, because she grew into one of the most physically driven kids in her town. She became a competitive skier, training in downhill and slalom, and by her own account years later, she was named a substitute on the Czechoslovak ski team for the 1972 Winter Olympics in Sapporo, a claim that gave her an aura of athletic legitimacy she'd carry into every interview for the rest of her life, even though it was never independently confirmed by Olympic records. She studied at Charles University in Prague and came away with a degree connected to physical education, on top of a modeling career that was already picking up steam. Modeling in Czechoslovakia in the early 1970s meant covers of local magazines and day rates that were considered good money at the time, but it wasn't a path to the West on its own. That took a marriage. In 1971, Ivana married an Austrian ski instructor named Alfred Winkelmeyer. It gave her an Austrian passport and, more importantly, a legal way out of a country most people her age could only leave with a defection. She and Winkelmeyer never really built a life together as a couple, and the marriage ended within a few years, formally dissolving around 1973. What it did was open a door. As early as 1971, before she'd even left Czechoslovakia for good, she was already earning around $38 a day for photo shoots in Prague, a rate that was considered genuinely good money there at the time, and she'd landed on the cover of at least one national fashion magazine. She also spent a brief stretch appearing on Czechoslovak television, including a small role in a children's series called Pan Tau in 1970. Ivana moved to Montreal in the mid-1970s, working as a ski instructor to pay the bills while she pushed her modeling career further, picking up night classes in English at McGill University along the way. She modeled for department stores, for a Canadian fashion designer, and did promotional work tied to the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal. She was sharp, she was fluent in several languages by that point, and she was clearly not interested in staying a small-town girl from behind the Iron Curtain. Years later, after the Velvet Revolution ended communist rule in Czechoslovakia, declassified files from the country's secret police, the St. B, showed that agents had been tracking Ivana since the mid-1970s, noting her trips back home in 1975 and 1977, and keeping tabs on her family and associates. Her marriage to a rising American businessman had made her, in the eyes of that regime, a person worth watching. In 1976, a modeling assignment sent her and a group of other models to New York City. That trip is where this whole story actually starts. Ivana was in Manhattan with the other models when she was introduced to a 29-year-old real estate developer named Donald Trump, a guy who was just starting to push his father's outer borough real estate business into flashier Manhattan projects. According to one account of that first meeting, Ivana and the group of models she was traveling with ended up seated at a trendy restaurant that evening, courtesy of Trump, who had already built himself a reputation as someone eager to make an impression on anyone new in his orbit. By her own description in a later memoir, she found him smart, funny, and, in her words, an all-American good guy. Trump, for his part, was taken with her immediately, and the courtship moved fast. unfolding over roughly 6 months of dinners and long-distance calls between New York and Montreal before he proposed. Within months, they were engaged, and on April 9, 1977, they married at Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan in a ceremony performed by the minister Norman Vincent Peale, the same pastor whose sermons on positive thinking had shaped Trump's own father. Ivana was 28. Before the wedding, the two of them sat down to negotiate a prenuptial agreement, and this detail matters a lot for everything that comes later, because this wasn't a one-time signature. It was the first draft of an agreement that would get renegotiated again and again as Trump's fortune grew. The early talks weren't smooth. Trump reportedly wanted a clause requiring Ivana to return any jewelry she'd been given if they ever divorced, which she flatly rejected. She also pushed for what she called a rainy day fund in case the marriage fell apart, and the two settled on $100,000. That number would look almost quaint within a few years. If you've made it this far, you can probably tell this story only gets more complicated from here, and we're just getting into the marriage itself. This is exactly the kind of deep dive we do on this channel regularly, so if you haven't already, subscribe now so you don't miss the rest of it, because the next 20-some minutes cover things that never really got the full picture treatment anywhere else. Chapter 4. Building an Empire Together. Once they were married, Ivana didn't settle into a purely decorative role, and this is something that often gets flattened in the shorthand version of her story. She took an actual job inside the Trump organization, starting as Vice President of Interior Design. She oversaw the design work on major projects, including input into Trump Tower, the building that would become the company's signature address on Fifth Avenue, and she was also credited with interior design work on the Grand Hyatt Hotel, one of the earlier projects that had helped establish Trump's reputation in Manhattan real estate before Trump Tower even existed. From there, her responsibilities grew. She was named president and later chief executive of Trump's Castle, the casino and hotel property in Atlantic City, putting her in charge of a large-scale gaming operation at a time when very few women ran casinos anywhere in the country. She also managed the Plaza Hotel after Trump bought it in 1988 for roughly $400 million, overseeing a legendary, if aging, piece of New York real estate. Trump himself would later joke publicly that he was paying his wife $1 a year plus all the dresses she could buy to run the place, a line that got repeated constantly in the press at the time, and that Ivana herself never seemed thrilled about. On top of the corporate titles, the couple had 3 children together during these years. Donald Trump Jr. was born on December 31, 1977, less than 9 months after the wedding. Ivanka followed on October 30, 1981. Eric was born on January 6, 1984. Despite the demands of raising 3 kids, Ivana kept working, kept a public presence, and the two of them became fixtures of New York's social calendar throughout the 1980s, showing up at galas, state dinners, and society pages with a regularity that made the phrase power couple feel almost literal. Ivana later said she didn't mind the traditional dynamic of the marriage, describing herself as someone who wanted a strong man to build a life around, while still building her own career on the side. It's worth saying plainly that this period wasn't performance for its own sake. Ivana was, by most accounts from people who worked with her, a demanding and effective executive, and the business results at Trump's Castle and elsewhere reflected real decisions she made, not just a famous last name attached to a title. She also worked to keep her children connected to where she came from. Every summer, Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric would spend weeks in Czechoslovakia with their grandfather Miloš, fishing and camping near Prague and Zlín, learning to speak Czech in a household that otherwise revolved entirely around Manhattan real estate and Atlantic City casino floors. It was an odd split existence for 3 American kids: private schools and helicopter rides during the school year, then a working-class Czech village during the summer, courtesy of a mother who wasn't interested in letting her old life disappear just because her new one had gotten so loud. Chapter 5. The Prenup Game. That original prenuptial agreement from 1977 didn't stay fixed. As Trump's business grew through the late 70s and into the 80s, the two of them sat down and renegotiated the terms more than once. In 1979, the divorce fund that had started at $100,000 was bumped up to $750,000. As Trump's real estate holdings expanded further, they revised the agreement again in 1984, this time pushing the guaranteed payout to $2.5 million, and once more in 1987. Each renegotiation reflected the same basic dynamic. Trump's net worth was climbing fast, and Ivana, who by then had a law degree's worth of experience in how these documents worked from sitting through every draft, wanted the floor raised to match it. Reporting on the final version of the agreement described a document that capped Ivana's cash payout at $25 million, regardless of what Trump was actually worth at the time of a divorce, along with one Connecticut property, and child support tied to his income level at the point of signing. It also, by most accounts, sharply limited any ongoing alimony and gave her no equity stake in the Trump organization itself. In hindsight, this structure set up almost everything that happened in 1990. Because when the marriage did collapse, that $25 million ceiling became the exact thing Ivana's legal team tried to break through. What made the whole arrangement unusual for its time was how openly transactional it was allowed to be. Each renegotiation happened with separate attorneys representing both sides, and each version was treated less like a formality and more like an actual business contract getting periodically updated to reflect a growing company, which in a sense is exactly what it was. Ivana wasn't shy about it either. Friends and biographers who covered the marriage over the years described her as someone who understood the mechanics of Trump's business better than most of his own executives, and the prenup renegotiations were, in a strange way, one more place where that showed. Chapter 6. Cracks in the Marriage. By the late 1980s, the marriage that had powered so much of the Trump public image for over a decade was under real strain. Trump's businesses were expanding aggressively, taking on enormous debt to fund casino projects and other ventures, and the pressure showed at home. In his own later writing, Trump admitted he'd grown frustrated with what he described as Ivana's drive toward an active social calendar, and he acknowledged, in his own words, that he made a mistake by not talking things through with her and essentially checking out of the relationship instead. In that same book called Surviving at the Top, he was insistent on one specific point, that he hadn't left the marriage for another woman, and that whatever came afterward with Marla Maples wasn't the reason he checked out in the first place, he simply left. One specific incident from 1989 became a central and disputed part of the marriage's final chapter. According to a sworn deposition Ivana gave during the 1990 divorce proceedings, later obtained and published by journalist Harry Hurt III in his 1993 book Lost Tycoon, Trump had undergone a painful scalp reduction surgery to address hair loss, a procedure performed by a doctor Ivana had recommended. According to the account in that deposition, an enraged Trump confronted her afterward, pulled out a handful of her hair, tore her clothing, and forced himself on her sexually, an act her deposition described using the word rape. The book describes her spending that night locked away and crying, and Trump the next morning asking her, with what Hurt described as menacing casualness, whether it hurt. Trump has denied the allegation entirely, including denying that he ever had the scalp reduction procedure described in the account. When the story resurfaced publicly during his 2016 presidential campaign, Ivana herself issued a statement addressing it directly. Underneath all of this, the business itself was becoming a source of stress too. Trump had taken on staggering amounts of debt to build the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, along with financing several other casino and real estate projects at the same time, and by the end of the decade, the interest payments alone were becoming difficult to keep up with. Ivana was still running Trump's castle during this stretch, competing for the same Atlantic City gamblers her husband's other properties were chasing, which added a strange layer of internal competition to a marriage that was already under pressure from every other direction. Chapter 7. The Deposition and the Walkback. The word rape in a sworn legal document is not a small thing, and it's worth walking through exactly what happened with that claim over the following decades, because the record is genuinely more complicated than a single headline. The deposition itself was sealed as part of the divorce case, but Harry Hurt says he obtained a copy and that the incident described in it was corroborated to him by two people Ivana had confided in at the time. Hurt held on to that copy for years afterward, describing it later as sworn testimony he felt obligated to keep, until, during his own divorce, he cleaned out his files and said he ended up throwing it out along with everything else. When his book was published in 1993, Trump's legal team pressured the publisher, W. W. Norton, into inserting a clarifying statement from Ivana directly into the book itself. In that statement, she confirmed she had used the word raped in her deposition describing the incident, but she added that she did not want the term understood in what she called a literal or criminal sense, saying instead that as a woman she felt violated. That clarification became the standard reference point every time the story resurfaced publicly, which it did more than once. In 2015, during Trump's first run for president, the Daily Beast published a piece revisiting the deposition, prompting a furious response from Trump's then-attorney Michael Cohen, who threatened the reporter personally and warned of a defamation lawsuit worth $500 million if the story used the word rape in connection with Trump. Ivana herself responded publicly around this time too, calling herself and Donald the best of friends and describing the old claims as belonging to a moment of very high tension during a difficult divorce. Cohen's exact words to the reporter working on that story were caught on tape, and he didn't hold back, warning that there was nothing reasonable about writing a piece around someone's use of the word rape and threatening a lawsuit he pegged at $500 million, the same figure he claimed to have used against another media outlet before. The reporting also noted that the story had first surfaced back in the mid-1990s, years before Trump ever ran for president, meaning the claim wasn't something invented for political purposes. It had simply been sitting in the public record since Hurt's book came out, and kept resurfacing whenever Trump's profile grew larger. There's no public record of Ivana ever filing a separate police report or pursuing a standalone criminal or civil case over the incident beyond what appeared in the divorce deposition itself, and no criminal investigation was ever opened. What exists is a sworn statement made under oath in 1990, a later published clarification softening the language, and decades of public statements from Ivana that ranged from distancing herself from the claim to actively defending Trump. Both of those things are part of the same historical record, and neither one cancels the other out. Chapter 8. Aspen. The event that actually ended the marriage in the public eye had nothing to do with the deposition, which stayed sealed and largely unknown until years later. It was an affair, and it came apart in the worst possible place for privacy, a ski resort during the holidays. In late 1989, the Trump family was in Aspen, Colorado for their usual winter vacation, and so, separately, was a 25-year-old model and actress named Marla Maples, who Trump had been seeing for some time already. The two women crossed paths directly at a restaurant called Bonnie's, on the mountain. By multiple later accounts, including Ivana's own retelling in her memoir Raising Trump, Maples approached her and said, "I'm Marla and I love your husband, do you?" Ivana's response, in her own words, was to tell her to get lost, insisting she loved her husband, before walking away in shock. Other accounts of the same confrontation describe Ivana turning to Maples with a much sharper line, telling her to leave her husband alone. Either way, whatever ambiguity had existed around the affair evaporated on that mountain. Ivana said she knew immediately that the marriage was over. The story broke almost instantly in the New York tabloids, and for the next several months, the Trumps' personal life became inescapable front-page material, day after day, in a way that turned a private marital collapse into one of the biggest media stories in the country. Maples herself was, in some ways, a mirror of Ivana's own origin story. She'd grown up in a small town in Georgia, competed in beauty pageants, played basketball, and eventually won the title of Miss Hawaiian Tropic before her career brought her into Trump's orbit. Speaking to Vanity Fair in 1990, not long after the Aspen story broke, Maples described feeling for Ivana and insisted the relationship wasn't really about her, saying she'd spent a long time as Trump's friend and had actually encouraged him to stay and make the marriage work for the sake of his kids. Whatever the private reality was, the public story had already been written, and there was no putting it back. Ivana filed for divorce in early 1990. Their 3 children took the news hard. According to Ivana's own account, Donald Trump Jr., a teenager at the time, refused to speak to his father for a full year following the split. Chapter 9. The Tabloid War. What happened next turned an already messy divorce into a full-blown media circus, one that both sides, according to later reporting, actively fed. On February 16, 1990, the New York Post ran a front-page headline that would end up outliving almost everyone involved in the story, "Best Sex I Ever Had," attributed to Marla Maples describing her time with Trump. According to the Post reporter who wrote it, Bill Hoffman, the line came from 2 of Maples' acting class friends, who told him Maples had described the relationship to them in exactly those terms. A different account, published years later by former Post journalist Jill Brooke, told a stranger version of events. Brooke said she was in the room when Trump called the Post's editor at the time, Jerry Nachman, pitching a story about himself. When Nachman told him a front page needed a real hook, something along the lines of murder, money, or sex, Trump reportedly answered on the spot that Marla says, "With me, it's the best sex she's ever had," then called out to Maples standing nearby to confirm it, getting back a faint yes, Donald in response. Whether the quote came from Maples' friends or from Trump feeding it to his own tabloid contact or some combination of both, it became one of the most recognizable headlines of the entire decade, and Maples herself later muddied the record further. Asked about it directly by reporters outside a Manhattan courthouse decades later, she denied ever saying it, telling them only that the truth would come out, just not there, before walking off with a wink. It's a small, strange detail in a much bigger story, but it captures something real about how this entire divorce played out. A private marriage collapsing in full view of the public, with tabloids on both sides getting fed quotes, and nobody involved ever fully agreeing afterward on what had actually been said. Chapter 10. The Divorce War. Ivana hired a well-known entertainment attorney, Neil Papiano, and set out to challenge the prenuptial agreement she had signed and revised 4 separate times over the previous 13 years. Her legal team's opening position, according to reporting at the time, was a request for half of Trump's net worth, which was estimated then somewhere between $1.7 and $5 billion depending on the source. Her argument for tossing out the prenup rested on 2 claims: that Trump had pressured her into signing each revised version without adequate independent counsel, and separately, that his conduct during the marriage, including the affair and the allegations of cruel and inhumane treatment, should void the agreement's protections outright. The timing worked against her in one specific way. Trump's real estate and casino empire was, at that exact moment, buckling under enormous debt, with the Taj Mahal Casino in Atlantic City and several other properties pushing him toward what he later admitted, in an interview with Howard Stern, was the lowest financial point of his life, adding that his lenders genuinely weren't sure whether he was headed for bankruptcy. That financial instability became the backdrop for the settlement negotiations, and it shaped how the tabloids covered every twist of it. Marla Maples, asked by Vanity Fair about the size of Ivana's demands, put it bluntly at the time, saying Ivana wanted $1 billion but that there simply wasn't $1 billion to give her. The legal fight itself dragged on for the better part of a year, with both sides trading filings through 1990 while reporters camped outside the courthouse and every hearing generated fresh headlines. Trump's team, led by his own attorneys, argued the prenup was airtight regardless of how many times it had been revised, since Ivana had always had her own independent lawyer present at each renegotiation. Papiano countered that the pressure to sign, especially in the earliest version back in 1977, had been real enough to undermine the whole document. In the end, the courts did not throw out the prenup. Ivana's challenge to void it entirely was denied, but the 2 sides still reached a negotiated settlement that went beyond the original $25 million ceiling in some ways and fell short of it in others. The final divorce, granted in 1990 and formally finalized in 1992, cited cruel and inhumane treatment on Trump's part as the legal grounds. Under the settlement, Ivana received $14 million in cash, a 45-room mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, an apartment at Trump Plaza, use of Mar-a-Lago for 1 month each year, and roughly $650,000 annually in child support until the children turned 18, on top of separate spousal support reported at around $350,000 a year. She also retained full custody of Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric. Looking at the raw numbers afterward, some divorce attorneys who later reviewed the case called the settlement surprisingly modest given Trump's public reputation as a billionaire at the time, pointing out that $14 million was a fraction of what Ivana's team had originally sought, and that the real explanation was the mountain of debt sitting underneath his empire at that exact moment, debt that made his actual net worth far murkier than the tabloids covering the divorce ever let on. As a condition of the settlement, Ivana agreed to a non-disclosure agreement, one that required her, going forward, to get Trump's permission before publicly discussing the details of their marriage in depth. Trump, for his part, told reporters afterward that he was very happy the matter was behind him and called it a positive step for everyone involved. Chapter 11. Life after Donald. Trump moved on almost immediately. Marla Maples became pregnant shortly after the divorce was finalized. Their daughter Tiffany was born in 1993, and the two married that same year, only to separate in 1997 and divorce 2 years after that, following a very public affair of her own involving one of Trump's bodyguards on a Florida beach. Trump would go on to marry Melania Knauss in 2005, and they remain married today. Ivana, meanwhile, built an entirely separate second act, one that started almost immediately after the divorce was finalized. Rather than stepping back from public life, she leaned all the way into it, turning her own name into a brand the same way her ex-husband had. She launched her own lines of clothing, costume jewelry, and beauty products, selling them through the Home Shopping Network and QVC in the United Kingdom. From 1995 through 2010, she wrote a syndicated advice column called Ask Ivana for Globe magazine. She authored several books, including a self-help title called The Best Is Yet to Come, and, in 2017, her autobiography Raising Trump, which laid out her own account of the marriage in far more personal detail than had ever been public before, all while staying inside the boundaries of the NDA she'd signed decades earlier. She also married twice more. In 1995, she married Italian businessman Riccardo Mazzucchelli, a marriage that ended by 1997, followed by an on-and-off relationship with him that reportedly continued in some form for years afterward, even without the marriage itself. In 2008, she married Rossano Rubicondi, an Italian actor more than 2 decades her junior, at a wedding held at Mar-a-Lago that drew a crowd of tabloid photographers almost as large as the one that had covered her divorce nearly 2 decades earlier. That marriage also ended within roughly a year, formally in 2009, though the two reportedly stayed close afterward, and Rubicondi remained a fixture at her side at public events for years to come. Beyond the marriages, Ivana kept finding ways to stay in front of a camera. She did television spots promoting her products, made the rounds on talk shows, and in 2018 stood in the Oak Room at the Plaza Hotel, the same hotel she'd once managed for her first husband, to announce something she called the Italiano diet, a health and weight loss concept she was marketing under her own name. She clearly had no interest in fading into the background just because the marriage that made her famous had ended decades earlier. Despite everything that had happened in the divorce, Ivana and Donald Trump maintained a working relationship as co-parents, and, by most public accounts, an increasingly cordial one as the years went on. She spoke about talking to him regularly. She attended family events. During his 2016 campaign, she publicly rejected the resurfaced deposition claims and expressed support for his candidacy, and she remained a recognizable, outspoken figure in New York media circles well into her 70s, giving interviews where she was candid, sharp, and rarely apologetic about the life she'd built out of the wreckage of that marriage. She kept the Upper East Side townhouse she'd bought for $2.5 million the same year her divorce was finalized in 1992, living in it for the following 3 decades. She sold the Greenwich, Connecticut mansion from her settlement in 1998 for $15 million, a property that would later resell for $54 million, a small illustration of just how much that original real estate turned out to be worth over time. Through all of it, she leaned into a phrase that became something close to a personal slogan, telling anyone who asked that the best revenge was living well, and that her career afterward was proof she'd never needed the marriage to matter in the first place. Chapter 12: The End. Ivana Trump died on July 14, 2022, at her home in Manhattan, after falling down a steep, spiraling staircase. She was 73. A medical examiner ruled the death accidental, attributing it to blunt impact injuries to her torso. Donald Trump announced her passing himself, writing in a public statement that she was a wonderful, beautiful, and amazing woman who had led a great and inspirational life, and adding that her 3 children had always been her pride and joy. Tributes came in quickly from people across her life. Donald Trump Jr. posted a tribute online thanking his mother for pushing him hard and never letting him get away with anything, saying he was who he was because of her. 6 days later, on July 20th, she was given a private, invitation-only funeral mass at St. Vincent Ferrer Roman Catholic Church on Manhattan's Upper East Side, just blocks from the townhouse where she had lived for 3 decades. Her casket, described by attendees as a rose gold color, was carried in by her 3 children and their families. Donald Trump attended alongside his wife Melania and their son Barron, and Tiffany Trump, his daughter with Marla Maples, was there as well. During the service, Ivanka delivered a eulogy in which she said that growing up, her mother didn't tell her a woman could do anything she wanted. She showed her, calling Ivana a trailblazer to men and women alike. Ivana was buried afterward at Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster, New Jersey, in a plot overlooking the first hole, a piece of property that, in a strange bit of symmetry, belonged to the same man she'd spent 15 years married to and another 3 decades staying connected with as a co-parent. She left behind an estate valued at roughly $34 million, split primarily between her 3 children. It's worth remembering that this was a woman who left communist Czechoslovakia with a modeling portfolio and an Austrian passport, married one of the most talked-about men in America, ran a casino, survived one of the most publicly humiliating divorces of the 20th century, and still managed to build a business empire entirely under her own name afterward. In the end, the story of Ivana and Donald Trump was never really the fairy tale sold in the tabloids of the 1980s, and it wasn't purely the tabloid scandal of the early 1990s either. It was a 15-year business and personal partnership between 2 extremely driven people, one that included real professional achievement on her part, a documented and disputed allegation of sexual assault that neither side has ever fully agreed on, a decade of escalating legal paperwork, and a divorce that, for all its public messiness, still left both of them intact enough to build entirely new lives afterward. If you want the full story on what happened to Marla Maples after her own marriage to Trump fell apart, that video is up next, so go ahead and check it out.